Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this slow looking session from Royal Collection Trust. We're coming to you live this afternoon on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you really for taking a moment, for giving yourselves the opportunity to pause and to take a moment to explore a piece of art through the lens of mindfulness. So I'm delighted to be joined, as you will now see, by two of my wonderful colleagues. Lucy Wood, who is the Learning Manager at the Palace of Holyrood House. Lucy oversees our learning programme at His Majesty the King's official residence in Edinburgh. And Lucia van der Drift from the wonderful Limina Collective, an expert on art and mindfulness. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. Everybody, as we go through, please do feel free to put your comments in the chat on YouTube. We'll be keeping an eye on those and we'll use those for the basis of parts of the session a little bit later and an opportunity for questions at the end. But let's start, ladies. And Lucy, perhaps you can tell us, why have we chosen the artwork that we have chosen this afternoon, a portrait of King George IV?
Thank you, Amy. Yes, well, I think of all the wonderful works, objects, items, paintings, and portraits that are featured in the exhibition Style and Society that's currently in the King's Gallery here in Edinburgh, the work in question that we're focusing on today presents something of a unique opportunity, because for those who may have visited the palace before, ordinarily that painting hangs in the dining room in the Palace of Holyrood House, and now it's featured just for the duration of this exhibition in the King's Gallery. So first of all, we've got a work that might be quite familiar, but it's in a new location. And I think that really changes essentially how we physically look at a work, and therefore how it feels to us and what we're noticing. So it seems a really timely occasion to have this slow looking event. But I think also connected to that, it's the context of the painting. It helps us to reconsider the context of the work and where that's come from. So I'm really looking forward to being part of that exploration this afternoon with yourself, Lucia.
Yes, well, thank you both. Thanks for inviting me to join in with this event. I shall share my screen, and then we'll have a look at the painting that we will be concentrating on today. And so here it is. And I had a few questions for you, just for us to consider and getting used to looking at this painting before we start the slow looking sequence. Yes, just a question about what strikes you most about this painting. Just perhaps for you to consider. You might want to put your answer in the chat. If you want to do that, that would be fantastic to see a few comments there. So what strikes you most about this painting? So that's my first question. And then I have another question for you, and that is, what is one thing that delights you about this painting? One thing that might delight you about this painting. And then my last question would be, if you had to choose 3 adjectives to describe this painting, which adjectives would those be? So 3 adjectives to describe this painting. Well, we probably all have had our individual responses to that. I shall stop sharing my screen for a moment, and in a moment we are going to get back into that painting and do some slow looking with it. But first I thought I'd say a little bit about how we're going to approach that, and I wanted to tell you about myself just a tiny bit. So my name is Lucia van der Drift, and alongside of my colleague Carly Allen, we've been, you could say, pioneering mindfulness and applying mindfulness techniques to looking at artworks and we've been working mostly in museums, and we've been producing recordings, and I've had a really lovely connection with the Royal Collection these past years. And so we're applying mindfulness techniques to looking at paintings. So normally with mindfulness you'd have an object that is internal, you could say. We could focus on the breath, or you could focus on the body, or you could focus on the ground under your feet. And in the case of applying mindfulness to paintings, what we do is we have an external object. So we might look at colors and shapes and objects on a painting and use that to kind of focus ourselves, to ground ourselves. And particularly in when we're visiting a gallery, it might be quite overwhelming if we're seeing a lot of paintings. And if you're applying some sort of mindfulness technique to us looking at some of those paintings, we might find that we feel a bit more anchored, maybe in the gallery itself, but also in ourselves. So you might want to use this as a technique later on when you'll be visiting a gallery and looking at all these paintings. So this principle of anchoring or grounding is really about that a lot of the time we're kind of having lots of thoughts. We go here, we go there, we go everywhere in our thoughts. And when we also have emotions that might not always be so useful to go from one thought to another. And if we're using a technique like grounding ourselves, we might be able to have a little break from that. It's like our gateway into the here and the now, the grounding into something, whether it's our feet or an object or a color. So that's the principle of it that we might try out today. And before we, I'll guide you through a slow looking sequence at this painting. I'd like to guide you through a mindful pause, just a few minutes. So I might invite you to join in with that. And it's fairly simple. Let's, wherever you're sitting, maybe you can wriggle around a bit so you can feel your body on the chair. And then if you would like to join in with that, maybe close your eyes for a moment or lowering the gaze. And then just feeling the body on the chair. So feeling the weight of the body on the chair, maybe even giving the weight to the chair, to the ground, to the earth. And then inviting you to really feel the feet on the floor, the soles of the feet. And you might want to press your feet down into the floor a bit more. You're feeling the muscles flexing. You're really feeling that ground, that floor underneath. And then perhaps just noticing that contact with the floor. And then inviting you to come back to the whole body on the chair. Noticing the posture, noticing where your hands are. And then for the last moments of this mindful pause, inviting you to feel the breath coming into the body and leaving the body, very gently turning towards that breath, and the breath coming in and the breath going out. The breath coming in and the breath going out. So when you're ready, maybe wriggling your toes and fingers, wiggling, maybe a bit of a shoulder roll. And then opening the eyes, coming back to the screen, coming back to the session, and I'm ready to share my screen. So let's have a look at the work that is our object today. So here first, we see the painting in the context of the exhibition. And it's just good to maybe get a bit more of an idea of where it is at the moment. And then I'll bring us to the next slide. if we didn't have much of an idea about size just now, you might be able to see that on the right hand side, the height 279 centimeters, so yeah, quite large, quite high, and then the width 179.1 centimeters, and so that is the actual size of this painting. And then it's oil on canvas, and this is painted by Sir David Wilkie. We can see that at the top, late 18th century till the middle of the 19th, and then it's a portrait of George IV, and it was painted in 1827. So here we have a bit of information about the painting, and now let's go into it a bit more. So here we have our painting. Allowing the eyes to settle on this image. Just letting them go wherever they want to go. But perhaps for the time being, if it's possible, setting aside any information you may know about this painting, who the person is on it, and any objects we can see on it. So just maybe just letting that go for now and coming back into the looking. So inviting you to find the darker areas in this painting. Just allowing the eyes to come to those darker areas. And then perhaps finding the darkest area you can find, that you can see. There might be more darkest areas, but let's just go for one and just staying there for a few moments, focusing the eyes on that particular point in the painting. And then letting that go. And now inviting you to find the lightest areas in this painting, noting the very lightest areas. And then the same with the darkest areas. Let's find the very lightest area and focus on that. There might be more, just choose one. And then keeping the focus there for just a few cycles of breathing. Depending on how fast you are breathing, that's about it. And let's now explore any colors in this painting. Noticing blacks and greys and perhaps whites. Any reds. And greens, and perhaps also golden tones, and maybe any other color I haven't mentioned, maybe finding that, pinks or oranges. Now let's also notice in this painting any verticals, wherever you find vertical lines. And horizontals, just marking them with our eyes, and then perhaps also finding diagonals. So as we're looking at this painting, of course noting there is a figure here in the middle of this painting, but there's also some architectural elements here. So let's just find those with our eyes a low wall on the left, lower bottom, a column or pilaster on the right top, and then next to that some sort of circular shield on the wall. And then when we go down with our eyes, we might find the contours of a throne with some carved lions' heads. We can clearly see one in the foreground at the base of this throne. And then perhaps also noticing the one, its companion, a bit further into the painting, more in the shadow. Now also exploring the platform that this figure is standing on. And let's take a closer look. So noticing these feet planted on the floor, the flat shoes with the buckles, and the legs, and perhaps also the shadow casts on the floor. And perhaps for a moment here, let's come back to our own feet, just feeling those feet, feeling the firmness of the ground underneath our own feet. Anchoring ourselves again into the here and the now. And then coming back to this painting and noticing his stockings, the pattern on these stockings. And then perhaps also noticing parts of those legs we can see that are in the shadow. One leg, perhaps noticing that one leg is receiving more light than the other. And then let's shift, look a bit more to the kilt. Its patterns, and perhaps also noticing any textures here. Metal perhaps, some fur, fabric. And let's shift our attention to the hands, taking in the position of the hands. And perhaps also taking a moment now to look at your own hands or one of them. Just noticing the color and any light and shadow onto that hand. Different tones, the shape. And then let's come back to his hands again. Their color and texture, and perhaps looking at the one on the left first, noticing some rings as well. And then the one on the right, resting on the hilt of a sword, perhaps noticing these different components of the sword here. And perhaps also following the blade down a bit, and then back up. Noticing these individual fingers of that hand that's resting on that hilt. And then perhaps also looking at that cuff on the jacket. And then we'll look a bit further up this part. So let's go back to that cuff and looking at that sleeve, following it up, perhaps also noticing the parts of that sleeve that are in the shadow. That whole upper body, noticing the shadows there. A jacket. All these different components we can see. Belts. Items of clothing. Weaponry. And of course our minds are curious to learn more, but for now let's come back to the looking. Perhaps also noticing textures here, metal. And layered fabric. And then let's look at the face, taking in the face when we can see it clearly. Perhaps noticing that hair, the curls, the part of that face in the shadow, but the face turned towards the light. And noticing the play of light on this face, wherever we see those shadows on that face. The shape of that face. The eyebrows. And the nose, the mouth, and the chin, and the eyes. And also in the shadow, noticing that hat. And then some feathers sticking out of that hat. Let's look at the whole painting again. So taking in that whole painting, the whole figure, everything we've looked at, the architectural elements, some objects, the throne, the platform, and the shoes with the stockings and the legs and the kilt, the upper body with the jacket, the face with the hat, and then also looking at those hands and that one hand resting on that sword. And perhaps now we could follow that sword all the way down to the ground, landing back onto the ground. Noticing the space around this figure. space around that sword. And then perhaps also noticing the space around the image on the screen. And then perhaps also noticing the actual device that you're using for looking at this session. And the space around you with the objects in it, just perhaps having a look at your space, noticing the play of light in your space, the different objects there. Colors, shapes. And then bringing the looking to a close, and I shall stop sharing my screen. Yeah, here I am again. So that was just a brief, well, it wasn't that brief. That was us looking at that painting. I always think that whenever we've been looking at a painting, you always see more. Whenever you look at it again, you can look for a long time and then still discover details, but I don't know how that's been for you. There is some time now that we can respond to the painting with some writing prompts, and I hope that you have a pen at hand. I'll just give you a bit of time to find a pen and a notebook if that's what you need. I've got one here. But let's see if you find one, or you could maybe make some notes on your phone. It's the kind of writing that we're doing is just to reflect and discover and respond a bit more. We've been looking, we've been meditating, so now let's see where that goes. So I've got some prompts for you, and so this is not writing to produce an article, or there's no you can make as many errors as you like, as typo, spelling errors. So this is really about just expressing some thoughts. So my first prompt is just your response to this painting. So we have a few minutes, let's say 2 minutes, to just respond to this painting in writing for ourselves. Nobody needs to read this, it's only for your eye. So it's 2 minutes to respond to the painting. I'll bring it back on the screen as well, so we know what we've been looking at. So just 2 minutes to respond to the painting. So my next prompt, perhaps bringing this sentence to an end, or maybe making a few notes if you were in a flow of thought. And so my next prompt is coming up now. So another 2 minutes. Just read what you've written, and then maybe underline a phrase that you find that strikes you, find interesting, and then use that phrase to write a bit more. So you use that as a header to write a bit more. So I hope that that comes across clearly. So the prompt is to read what you've written, underline something that you find interesting or strikes you in what you've written, and then write a bit more about that. Okay, that's my 2 minutes. So that was about 2 minutes with a second prompt. So now just 1 minute maybe. We could reread whatever we've been writing just now. And perhaps if you're interested in doing that, I really invite you to do put some thoughts in the comments of the session. It's up to you, of course, but we'd love to hear from you. So just a moment, a minute of reading and digesting and reflecting a bit more. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. So over to this space together. And so hopefully we'll see Lucy soon and Amy. So at this point, we've just been maybe giving a few responses. I hope so. I don't know whether you've written anything, Lucy or Amy, but we'll maybe hear later. I don't know. Any? Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to start. Thank you for that, Lucia. I think what really struck me about the painting is I think if I was passing it in a gallery somewhere and didn't really know anything about it, I don't think I would stop and look. I guess it's that old adage of, don't judge a book by its cover. But with your helpful hints and tips and guided looking, I found myself sort of actually lingering a little bit more and concentrating a bit more on the detail and seeing things that I would just never have expected, like the wave on his hair, the kind of thoughtfulness in his eyes as he's looking across in the distance, and the grounded way that he stands, and it all sort of those little connections in the painting made it suddenly all that more interesting.
It was interesting as well, wasn't it? Because it is quite a dark painting. Well, Lucy might say more, but so you kind of you really have to look in order for things to kind of come more to the foreground, don't you think, Lucy?
Absolutely, and I think for me, again, as Amy said, with your sort of guiding us through the work, what struck me was, I think in the past I have looked at the work as being quite dark. But it was when you invited us to look at the places where the light hit. And for me, there was two places, the face and the feet. And suddenly I saw the painting, or the figure rather, in a different light. And he, to me, became a figure stepping out onto a stage, that the light looked as though he was illuminated for a theatrical purpose, which again is not something I've noticed before when I've been looking at it in the two contexts that I'm fortunate enough to have seen it in. So it was really that light that struck me in my looking.
Oh, lovely. Well, I think goodbye for now. We'll see you at the end again. I'm really looking forward to hearing Lucy.
Well, now that we've taken a closer look at the work, as Lucia says, I'd like to shine actually a little bit of a light into the context of this painting and the background from which George IV, seems to emerge out of and onto the canvas that we've been exploring this afternoon. So as I mentioned earlier on, ordinarily this painting is displayed in the dining room at the Palace of Holyrood House. It's part of a group of works and items in the Royal Collection which help to tell the narrative of that historic occasion for the palace and for Edinburgh, for Scotland in fact, which was the visit of George IV to Scotland in 1822. So that visit took place between the 15th and 29th of August 1822. And I want to share a little bit about what brought that about and some of the scenes that took place during that time, as well as how this painting represents part of that chapter in the palace's history. And so I will share my screen just now to start that off. Okay. So as I say, this was the occasion of George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822. Now, after his accession to the throne in 1820, there was an ambition to make the king as visible as possible around his kingdom. In the year of his coronation, George IV made successful tours to both Ireland and Hanover to celebrate his accession to the realm, and 1 year later, he made the journey to Scotland. The visit became known as the King's Jaunt, and it was an occasion infused with significance and symbolism, as this was to be the first visit by a monarch to Scotland since Charles II in 1651, and the first since the Act of Union in 1707. So this made it the first visit of a reigning monarch to Scotland in nearly 2 centuries. The visit saw the king set foot on Scottish ground, bringing him into the view of the people and the people of Scotland into the view of the king. Now, the most important man in arranging the whole visit was the Scottish writer, poet, and author, Sir Walter Scott. Here he is here. Now, Sir Walter Scott had a hand in arranging the whole visit. He was famed for his novels, which recreated a romantic view of Scotland's past, and he seized the opportunity in this visit to present the country as a plaided panorama overflowing with tartan and Highlanders. Now, the two men were actually known to each other prior to this visit in 1822. Quite simply, to put it, the then Prince Regent, so before his accession, George IV was actually something of a Walter Scott fan. So in 1815, the future king had invited Scott to supper at Carlton House and declared that he preferred Scott to every bard, past and present. And Scott too enjoyed the relationship that he had with his royal reader. He sent the future king this wonderful inscribed copy of his poem, The Lord of the Isles, and you can see the handwritten dedication and inscription on the poem in the inside cover there. The Prince Regent became an important part of another Edinburgh story before the visit of 1822, when in 1818, Scott wrote to the king to ask for permission to lead an expedition into Edinburgh Castle, and this was an expedition to seek and retrieve the honours of Scotland, the crown, sword and sceptre of state, from where they laid hidden from public view from over 100 years. Permission was granted, the honours were retrieved, and therefore for this act Scott was created Sir Walter Scott, receiving his baronetcy in 1820. So George IV was already quite a familiar figure, as I say, in a bigger Edinburgh story. And so on to the visit itself. On the 14th of August, 1822, the king arrived at Leith, the port of Edinburgh, on the Royal George. But typical to Edinburgh, due to heavy rain, he wasn't able to disembark until the following day. As he stepped ashore, he was wearing a thistle and a sprig of heather in his hat and a St. Andrew cross, which had been presented by the ladies of Edinburgh to the king. And the reports suggest that he was greeted enthusiastically when he disembarked from the ship. And Edinburgh itself, the city, was transformed into a grand theatre of spectacles and ceremonies. The king made his ceremonial entry to the city through a series of triumphal arches by way of Leith Walk, Princes Street and Carlton Hill. The various parts of the city unfolded before the king, presented as a series of spectacular and staged tableaux, which culminated in the magnificent sight of the Palace of Holyrood House, viewed against the dramatic backdrop of the extinct volcano Arthur's Seat. And huge crowds lined the route, and the whole way for 3 miles from shore to the palace was one mass of hope and joy, a contemporary report suggested, all engrossed with one object, responding to one pulsation. And those reports say that some 300,000 people lined the streets to watch this procession from Leith to Holyrood House. Now, at the palace, the king was presented with the keys, and you can see here that this is another painting by the same artist as the one we've been focusing on so far today, by David Wilkie. Now, this painting, which is named The Entrance of George IV to Holyrood House, was painted for the king to commemorate one of the first scenes of the visit, so the entrance of the king to the palace. And just to pick out some of the many figures that you can see here, well, of course, we've got George IV looking very stately in the centre of the painting, wearing Field Marshal's uniform. We've got the Duke of Hamilton, the hereditary keeper of the Palace of Holyrood House, who's presenting the keys to the palace to the king on a cushion, as you can see here, kneeling in front of the king. Then we can see here George Campbell, who's the 6th Duke of Argyll. He's dressed in Highland dress and standing in front of the palace. Behind him, you can see that the honours of Scotland are being held aloft on horseback. You can probably just about see the crown on the cushion there. And here's Walter Scott. There's a gentleman wearing a cap and a ruff around his neck, and just to his right, that's the poet and author Sir Walter Scott. So the person, the architect behind the entire visit. And then we can see some pages in the foreground as well, and a very small dog as well, which is always nice to see. Yet all is not quite as it seems, because in this particular painting, Wilkie is using something of artistic license. This presents a very magnificent view of the king's arrival at the palace, on the palace forecourt, being presented with the keys, and people climbing up onto the columns to catch a glimpse of the king. In reality, we think this ceremony didn't take place outside at all, but rather took place inside the palace. So here's Wilkie using, perhaps for the first time in our Looking this afternoon, a little bit of artistic license. So moving on to the next part here, a number of receptions were hosted by the king and took place at the Palace of Holyrood House, including a levee for some 1,200 gentlemen in the throne room at the Palace of Holyrood House. And you can see a depiction of the throne room on your screen now. So for that levee, the gentlemen were announced, they made their approach, they knelt, they kissed the hand of the king and then withdrew. This meant that about 15 gentlemen were presented every minute, giving them approximately 4 seconds each with the king. And this image here is a much later image. It's a 20th century image of the throne room, but it perhaps gives us a glimpse of what the scene may have looked like during that gentleman's levee with George IV, and how crowded and probably how exciting that would have looked and felt like. Now, at that levee, the gentlemen who were in attendance were encouraged to wear tartan. Walter Scott, who published fashion advice, or rather rules, for taking part during the visit, was an enthusiastic chairman of the Celtic Society, which promoted Highland culture and dress. The wearing of tartan had become more widespread since the lifting of the repression of tartan, which had followed the prescription, the Jacobite Rising in 1745 and prior to that. And as we've seen already, for that occasion, the king also followed suit. So he also wore a full Highland ensemble for that levee on the 17th of August. So let's also have another look at this image and see what is involved, what's been captured on canvas by the artists. So we can see the king wears a full Highland ensemble, and this particular ensemble was supplied by George Hunter and Co. of Princes Street in Edinburgh. And the cost of this ensemble was the equivalent of some £140,000 in today's money. So a really vast expense, and no expense has been spared for this ensemble. The bill for this is still in the Royal Archives, and it included 61 yards of royal satin or tartan, 31 yards of royal velvet, 17.5 yards of royal plaid cashmere. So as well as the actual clothing that's being worn, there are other items involved in making this a complete dress. And here are those in close-up on the screen now, the accoutrements worn by George IV and during this levee and captured in this portrait here. Now, the accoutrements that you can see, you have a dirk, a sword, we have a powdered flask and the belt as well. And you might be able to see that each of those items that are close up on your screen have been included by Wilkie in the final portrait. And actually those items were supplied to Wilkie whilst he was finishing the portrait, while he was capturing all those details, so that he could render them truly representative and make sure those details were absolutely accurate. And here, just to give you a close-up of just how detailed those items are. This is from the sword that George IV is holding in his hand and almost leaning on there. You can see that the sword is blue steel, damasked in gold, and you have beautiful carvings and patterns depicted there, including Scottish symbols such as St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, and on the other side there we have the badge of the Order of the Thistle, the highest chivalric order in Scotland. Now, Wilkie obtained an invitation to take this portrait through Scott, and he wrote to his sister about the king. He looked exceedingly well in tartan. He had on the kilt and the hose with a kind of flesh-coloured pantaloons underneath. Now, in that letter to his sister, we learn two things. One is that Wilkie's portrait and approach to it was flattering. The second is the revelation of an item of clothing that we don't perhaps see in this portrait, which is those flesh-coloured pantaloons. In fact, the report suggests that George IV was quite concerned about the Edinburgh weather and being cold wearing his kilt, but also perhaps slightly concerned about showing his knees as well. And so the remedy was to wear pantaloons, as say flesh-coloured pantaloons, underneath his kilt. So very diplomatically, Wilkie has chosen not to depict those pantaloons in the final image. But not only that, reports of the day also reveal that the common opinion was that George IV rather wore his kilt slightly too short than was fashionable to do so. And a society wit, Lady Hamilton Dalrymple, apparently observed this and commented, "Well, since he is to be amongst us for so short a time, the more we see of him, the better." Now, 3 days after the gentleman's levee, George IV also held a drawing room for ladies at the palace, and you can see a sketch of this on your screen now. And again, similarly, this is a sketch, a preparatory drawing undertaken by Wilkie. And once again, fashion advice was circulated and published in advance for those attending, and this stated that the ladies must all appear in court plumes and fans. At least 9 feathers must be in every headdress. 457 ladies attended that particular drawing room, though each lady had to be chaperoned by their presenters or husbands or other men of the family. So in reality, that 457 was more likely some 2,600 people attending. The visit continued with a number of extremely well-attended events, including a procession from the Palace of Holyrood House to Edinburgh Castle, a Highland ball, a visit to the theatre, and a review of troops. At Edinburgh Castle, the king remained on the platform for a while, despite the rain, and when one of his attendants expressed concern that he would get wet, the king replied, "Oh, never mind, I must cheer the people." Near to the end of his time in Edinburgh, George IV once again paid a visit to the Palace of Holyrood House, and this was in order to inspect the apartments, specifically those connected with Mary, Queen of Scots. And the Duke of Hamilton, the gentleman we saw kneeling with the keys, took the king to Mary, Queen of Scots' apartments, and you can see a depiction of that on the right-hand side of your screen. And apparently the king gave a special order that whilst the palace was to be repaired generally, he said these apartments should be preserved sacred from every alteration. After a final appearance at the Theatre Royal for a performance of Scott's Rob Roy and a reception at Hopeton House on the 29th of August, the king once again boarded the Royal George and set sail, again in heavy rain, for England. The visit, which was witnessed by 1/7 of the Scottish population, was proclaimed a huge success. It achieved its aims of grounding the king within Scotland by raising his visibility, and as one observer later reflected, "Our king has seen his people, and they have seen their king."
Thank you, Lucy, for that really interesting historical overview and a bit more of an introduction into George IV. So I think we've got just a few minutes now for a few questions for you both, if you're happy to answer a couple. First one, I think to you, Lucy, there's been a few comments in the chat about George IV and the style of the painting. A couple of people have described him as a bit of a dandy. So do you think, do you think that this portrait of George IV is representative of his style generally?
That's such an interesting question. I think most reports of George IV, well, many reports suggest that he's quite lavish and ostentatious, I think, and that extends to his dress. But also lots of the reports of George IV say that he was very fashionable and fashion conscious, alive to the tastes and trends of the day. So I think that's something certainly when we're looking at portraits that are included in the exhibition Stylist Society, we can see that reflected in the way that he's wearing his hair and changing the dress that he's wearing according to the trends and styles. I think in this portrait, there's an intentional desire to capture the king wearing his Highland dress. And I believe I'm right in saying that this occasion, that gentleman's levee, was the only occasion during his visit that he actually wore that ensemble. So it really was a sort of a one-off. And I think the desire to capture that portrait really speaks to the impression that George IV wanted to make and wanted to be the lasting impression of his visit to Scotland.
Thank you. And what about Wilkie? He was a Scottish artist, but how much do you think, or can you say, is this portrait typical of his work? I mean, was he a very patriotic Scottish artist?
Again, an interesting question. So he's a Scottish artist, and he travelled to Edinburgh specifically for the visit of 1822, as did other artists, including Turner, looking to capture some of the magnificent and historic scenes that were taking place. As regards whether or not this is typical of Wilkie's work, we have got a little bit of an insight of what it was he was aiming for in this particular work. So I can read a quote here. He described the portrait as the most glazed and most deepest tone picture I've ever tried. It is at once a trial of Rembrandt all over, the dresses, the accoutrements, the throne in gold, a dark background, no white except the hose and flesh, telling his principal lights. The low perspective is thought new and successful. So I think in this particular painting, he's aiming at the old masters. He's aiming to sort of, if not imitate, then replicate that style. So something suitably grand, stately, and historic.
Lovely. And do we know, did George IV ever go back to Scotland?
I don't believe he did. I don't know for absolutely certain, but I don't believe he did. But the city still does, or Edinburgh still does, sort of bear the sort of, I suppose, the memory. Even in the actual geography of the city, there are streets, famous streets named after George IV and different things like that, so that the visitors really remembered, I think, in the actual geography of the city as well. But I don't think he ever came back.
Thank you. Then Lucia, just a question for you. We talked a little bit in our chat earlier about what drew us into the painting, and Lucy's just referred now to the old masters and Wilkie's style, and we saw some of that in his contrast of light and dark and the colour. And so it seems like there's some really clear ways that you can engage in slow looking with something like a painting by looking at textures and colours. Do you have any tips for us on how we might use slow looking to explore sculpture or other 3D pieces of art?
Yes, that's a lovely question. I love looking at slow looking at sculpture. So first, there is something that I think the play of light is just always so interesting, because not only on the object itself you can see how the shadows are cast, and I also love to look at like the shadow that the whole sculpture is casting, wherever it is, and looking at the lights in situ. But there is also something I think you could do, which is just noticing the space around you, noticing the space around that sculpture, if that's what we're looking at. And then also noticing the space between you and that object. And sometimes what I always reflect on, then it's just that materiality. So there's shapes and forms. So this is flesh and blood, and there is this object of sort of, it's just interesting, I think, to contemplate a bit more about like the nature of material, for instance. And then the lovely thing about the sculpture, if it's not behind glass or anything, if you can walk around it, and you can kind of look at it from all these kind of all the angles, and maybe even looking a bit from above and looking a bit from below, and so I think you can it's very, very interesting. Hope that helps.
Lovely, Lucia. Thank you both very much for your inputs and for joining us this afternoon. So let me just now, as we slowly wrap up, to say goodbye, just share this last screen with our viewers out there, so you know where to find out more if you would like to. The place to start is our Royal Collection Trust website, rct.uk. You can find out a little bit more about the exhibition, Style and Society Dressing the Georgians, which, as Lucy said, is currently on display at the Queen's Gallery at the Palace of Holyrood House. You can also, if you're near any of the official residences, find out there on our website about visiting those that are open to the public. And if you are too far away to visit, but you really want to find out more, then we do have another online lecture on the Style and Society exhibition on the 28th of May, and you can find those details on the What's On section of our website as well. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, everyone, and I hope this has given you a peacefulness that you can now take with you on through the rest of your day. Thank you very much and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.